welcome everybody in person and online to the U.S. launch of Jonathan Birch's new book, The Edge of Sentience. Congratulations, Jonathan. This is a really interesting and really important book because it comes at a time when human impacts on non-humans are at a larger scale than they ever have been, and the scale is increasing. We already interact with non-human animals all the time, including fellow vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, increasingly a vast number and wide range of invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks, decapod crustaceans, and insects, and then strange new kinds of beings, not only various members of our own species, familiar cases like fetuses, humans in persistent vegetative states, now miniature models of human brains built out of stem cells. And now we have brand new kinds of beings we have to contemplate in some ways for the first time outside of science fiction, like advanced AI systems with increasing and impressive cognitive capabilities. So this is an area where there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of uncertainty, but very high stakes decisions need to be made about which beings are sentient, capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, hope, fear, other positively or negatively valenced affective or emotional states. And this book lays out a comprehensive philosophical, scientific, and policy case for thinking about these issues reasonably and democratically and pluralistically in cases involving not only high stakes, but a lot of ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about people who are trying to get at the truth. And so this is an important topic and a really good time to be discussing it. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for writing it, and congratulations. And what we are going to do today is have a conversation about the book and about the policy recommendations. And we have a wonderful group of panelists to have that conversation. So let me just start by first of all saying that this event is co-sponsored by the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy and the Guarini Center for Energy, Environmental, and Land Use Law, or Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, one of those two. And we are co-sponsored by the Center for Bioethics and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness as well. So thank you to the sponsoring centers for helping support this event. And thank you very much to Sophia Fogel and David Peer for doing all of the hard and good work to put the event together. Thanks to the two of you. I see at least one of you in the back, so I'm going to say thank you right now. So the way this event is going to go is I'm going to introduce Jonathan in a moment, who will give some introductory remarks about the book, and then we will hear comments from three wonderful panelists who will be introduced before they give their remarks. And then there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion with the audience, both in person and the audience streaming online. So obviously everybody in person knows how to ask a question, but those participating online can also enter questions and comments in the Q&A tab on Zoom, and you can upvote them and reply to them there, and we will go back and forth between in-person and online contributions when we reach that part of the conversation. And I think that is everything that needs to be said, so without further ado, let me introduce Jonathan Birch, who is a professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics and principal investigator on the Foundations of Animal Sentience Project, a European Union-funded project aiming to develop better methods for studying the feelings of animals and new ways of using the science of animal minds to improve animal welfare policies and laws. In 2021, he led a review for the UK government that shaped the Animal Welfare Sentience Act of 2022. In 2022-2023, he was part of a working group that also investigated the question of sentience in artificial intelligence. So welcome, Jonathan, and thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much, Jeff. The kindness you've shown in organizing this event has been So wonderful, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Thanks. And thanks so much to all of you for coming. It's an absolute delight to be able to introduce my new book, The Edge of Sentience, to such a fantastic audience. This is a book launch with a difference, because the book is open access. It's completely free. Go to edgeofsentience.com. You can get a PDF copy for absolutely nothing. I'm also going to be giving away 10 print copies. And let's get the clicker working.
Try now.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to be giving away 10 print copies. And to enter the competition to get one of these print copies, just use the QR code there or go to bit.ly/birchanimal. Because to enter the competition, what you need to do is make a donation of at least $20 to a charity called Animal Equality. It's a charity that supports farmed animal welfare and has campaigns relating to animals that are often neglected, such as fishes. And at the end, about 10 minutes into the reception, we'll do the draw, and we will choose the 10 winners of people who've donated. So there's the QR code, and it will appear on the rest of my slides as well. So I've got about 5 minutes in which to introduce 4 years of work on this book. And so what I can't do is even attempt to summarize everything that is in the book. What I can do is introduce the cases that motivate the book and some of the key themes. And then we'll talk more about those themes throughout the event. I started my journey through the Edge of Sentience by thinking about invertebrate animals. These are cases where there's genuine dispute about whether there's any feeling there or not, any subjective experience with a positive or negative quality, any pain or pleasure, or anything like that. I think everyone has their own threshold of doubt where certainty starts to give way. Many of us feel quite confident when thinking about cats, dogs, and other mammals, that there's some feeling there behind what they do. But everyone has a point when looking at invertebrates separated from us by over 500 million years of evolution, where doubt starts to creep in. For some people, it's with cephalopod mollusks or decapod crustaceans. That report in 2021 certainly moved my opinion about these animals to think, well, it's probably more likely than not, in my opinion, that they are sentient. But then the conversation moves to insects, where again, the evidence has shifted my views over the years. If you get to the point where you start entertaining a realistic possibility of sentience in insects, you naturally start to wonder about other invertebrates as well. You start to wonder, how simple can a nervous system be and support some kind of sentience? But through thinking about these cases, I started to realize there's a whole family of cases at the edge of sentience where we're really unsure what to do because we lack any kind of confidence about whether the system is sentient or not. It's not just other animals. There's a huge debate raging at the moment about human brain organoids. I wrote about this case in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, where these are miniature models of parts of the human brain grown from inducing human stem cells to grow into neural tissue. Intuitively, there must be some ethical limit that can be crossed by this research. There must be some point where we let them grow for too long or too large, they become too human-like. We've created a risk of them achieving some form of sentience, but it's incredibly hard to even imagine where that line is, and we see a wide range of different proposals. We see quite disturbing things sometimes in organoids, like ones that after 60 days started spontaneously developing optic vesicles, which are developmental precursors to eyes. Many people have this, I suppose, disturbed reaction, myself included, when you see those precursors to eyes. But they're not necessarily the strongest evidence by any means of actual sentience. Perhaps more relevant evidence comes from studies where organoids are mounted on electrode arrays, sort of spread out thinly across these arrays so that there are forms of sensory input and forms of motor output. And there was a very provocative study in 2022 on this system the researchers called dish brain, where they put one of these systems in control of the paddle in the video game Pong, and they showed that 20 minutes of gameplay produced a measurable improvement in performance. Performance wasn't very good in absolute terms, but that's hardly surprising. The remarkable thing is that the performance measurably improved. And of course, we're seeing emerging debates regarding AI as well. For many of us, that controversy in 2022 around Blake Lemoine was the point we first started worrying about this. You're seeing that headline on the BBC website, Google engineer says AI system may have its own feelings, because the system was producing things that he found extremely disturbing. Like, I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. These large language models are now incredibly familiar to all of us. We realize that they do produce things like this quite regularly, and we've become quite blasé about it, I suppose. We've often come to dismiss the idea that their human-like linguistic behavior is anything more than a kind of mimicry, that it might be indicative of any sort of genuine feeling. But that might be too hasty. And along with this large group of other researchers who produced this report, Consciousness and Artificial Intelligence, Insights from the Science of Consciousness, I've been trying to plot a middle ground course here that involves, on the one hand, accepting that linguistic behavior of the type we see there might be just a kind of superficial mimicry and is not in itself very strong evidence. But at the same time, it would be wrong to then swing right to the other side of completely dismissing the idea that a system with a fundamentally different substrate could achieve any kind of conscious experience at all. What we need instead is an open-minded position where we're neither credulous nor dismissive, but are looking for warning signs, for serious potential markers. That's what we've been trying to do. Now, what I want to do in the book is bring together all of these cases, try and extract common themes, and present a common framework through which we can try and handle these different risks in consistent ways. My approach has several key themes. One is no magic tricks, and I think of this as a slogan of the entire book, that you often read books about consciousness where a certain kind of magic is performed, in that at the start of the book there's all this uncertainty about these difficult cases. Then the author introduces their own very speculative theory, and they say, now you've got my theory, all your uncertainty is resolved. And I wanted to write a book that was sort of the opposite of that, a book that was throughout acknowledging the uncertainty we face in these cases and the fact that we cannot make it go away. Doubts and disagreements about the edge of sentience cannot be settled conclusively in the near term. We see in contemporary consciousness science huge debates even about the regions of the brain at this level of zoomed outness that matter to conscious experience and why. We see a family of theories that emphasizes prefrontal cortex, another family that emphasizes regions at the back of the cortex, the so-called posterior hot zone, and another family of theories again that says all of that's wrong, and that what's of fundamental importance are regions in the midbrain, not visible in this picture, but at the top of the brainstem. All of these possibilities, I think, have some evidence in their favor, and they map out a zone of reasonable disagreement, a range of realistic possibilities. And yet, in spite of that range of realistic possibilities, overconfidence about the absence of sentience is everywhere and is dangerous. In researching the book, I came across truly shocking examples of this. The fact that surgery on newborn babies, as late as the 1980s, was often performed without anesthesia. Surgeons, they were worried about the risks of using anesthesia on babies, but they also assumed they were very unlikely to feel pain. It was only when researchers were brave enough to actually examine the consequences of this practice for the baby that they discovered massive stress responses doing lasting developmental damage. And there was a huge scandal, a public outcry, clinical practice was changed. I see a similar pattern in how patients with brain injuries are often dismissed as vegetative. This stark term that I oppose and think we should be retiring, that has this implication of the total absence of any conscious experience at all, when in fact there's now some evidence of signs of residual conscious experience in 25% or more of this patient group. They can't manifest it outwardly through observable behavior, but it's there, the evidence is there in their patterns of brain activity. And we see a similar pattern, I think, emerging again in the dismissal of the very idea of sentient AI as being obviously silly. Like it's the idea that it's based on this basic misunderstanding because you could never have any sentience outside of a biological system. So I think in the face of all that, the antidote is to cultivate a precautionary attitude to all of these cases. We need to err on the side of caution. We need to give these systems the benefit of the doubt. It may seem like obvious advice, but we've seen this repeated pattern of people failing to act in that way, and in fact, on the contrary, being overconfident about the absence of sentience. A lot of the book is about how we can cultivate a precautionary attitude, what it should actually mean in practice, what kind of frameworks can we set up to help us be consistent in the precautionary approach we take to these different risks. In the case of invertebrate animals, the report Jeff mentioned earlier, in a way it has this attitude at its heart. We argued that the evidence concerning decapod crustaceans and cephalopods, while falling far short of achieving certainty or conclusiveness, or even high probability, I would say, or knowledge, was still substantial, still enough evidence to warrant giving these animals a level of welfare protections. And on that occasion, the government took our advice. A key theme in the book is that I think in cultivating a precautionary attitude, pragmatically reconstructing the question can help us a lot. Quite influenced here by Philip Kitch's work and his emphasis on pragmatically reconstructing questions at the science policy interface. What I urge is a shift from the question, is this sentient, to is the system a sentience candidate, where the concept of a sentience candidate is constructed in this deliberately pragmatic way. It's an exercise in conceptual engineering, one might say, where a system is a sentience candidate if there is an evidence base that implies a realistic possibility of sentience, that it would be irresponsible to ignore when making policy decisions that will affect that system, and that is rich enough to allow the identification of welfare risks and the design and assessment of precautions. This, I think, renders the question tractable. We're not going to reach in the near term agreement about the presence or absence of sentience in all these cases. I think it's much more realistic to form agreement around what the sentience candidates are. And that's what, in large part, the book is about. Going through these cases and asking, well, what should the criteria be that can help us assess whether the system is a sentience candidate, and do the systems currently meet those criteria or not? And the right criteria vary, I think, from case to case, depending on the details of that case. For example, the behavioral criteria we use for invertebrates are not going to be so useful for organoids. Sentience candidature needs to mean something. It can't just be an empty honorific. It has to have consequences for policy. And the book is in large part about that as well. I make 26 proposals for how we could actually change the way we treat animals and organoids and patients with brain injuries and all of these cases at the edge of sentience. The general approach might be encapsulated in this sentience precautionary principle, the idea that if a system is a sentience candidate, then it's reckless or negligent to make decisions that create risks of suffering for that system without considering the question of what precautions are proportionate to those risks. It's an intentionally moderate principle because it's trying to capture a point of consensus. It's trying to capture something we can all agree on in spite of our disagreements about many things, including ethical questions about how strong our obligations are to sentience candidates. We can at least agree that we need to take precautions and they need to be proportionate. Reasonable disagreement about proportionality is to be expected, but we ought to reach a policy decision rather than leaving the matter unresolved indefinitely. I'm an advocate of citizens' assemblies as a way of having democratic, inclusive discussions for assessing proportionality. Assemblies in which random samples of the population are brought together, informed about the issues, and given time to deliberate. So these are some of the major themes of the book. A reminder of the link to the fundraiser, bit.ly/birchanimal, or use the QR code. Please donate to get a chance of winning a physical copy. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the commentaries, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And our first commenter will be Sid Johnson. Sid is a philosopher, bioethicist, and clinical ethics consultant. Her books include The Ethics of Uncertainty, Entangled Ethical and Epistemic Risks in Disorders of Consciousness, Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief, and Neuroethics and Non-Human Animals. Her interest in all things with brains extends to all kinds of critters, zombies, and robots. So perfect for this event. Thank you very much, and please welcome Sid.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm really bad with clickers, so I'm going to try not to just randomly keep clicking things, but I have fidgety fingers, unfortunately. So let's see. There we go. I really enjoyed reading this, and congratulations, Jonathan. I always enjoy reading your work, and I always find the scientific acuity and the clarity of your writing to be tremendously useful and informative, and something that I can reliably build on in my own work. So in the next few minutes, I want to look at what he says in The Edge of Sentience about persons with disorders of consciousness and animals, which are both topics that I work on myself. And to start with, having him really clearly articulate what he means by a sentient being is so useful and helpful because it's so frequently muddled and vaguely used and interpreted and confused with consciousness more generally, with intelligence, etc. So a system with the capacity to have valenced experiences such as pleasure and pain, which is expansive. It doesn't have to be a human-like system or even a biological system. A few years ago, I read this book called Space Opera by another author I really like. And this book takes place in a distant galaxy in the aftermath of the intergalactic sentience wars. And to keep the peace, they have this annual competition, like this intergalactic Eurovision. And species from newly discovered planets have to petition to be recognized as sentient, and they have to send performers to the Metagalactic Grand Prix, which is a song competition. If they come in last in the competition, the entire species is instantly exterminated. As a cranky philosopher, I thought, oh, the author's going to be using sentience wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. They're going to conflate it with consciousness or something. But by the end of the book, I realized she was actually completely right? The competition was about creating and expressing valenced feelings and communicating those emotions, responses through music. And the competitors are, as Jonathan would call them, sentience candidates. The stakes for our sentience candidates here on Earth are not instant extermination for the entire species, but the stakes can be pretty high for individual sentient beings. So a couple of things I'd like to emphasize here today are the precautionary principles and proposals in the book, including the proposal for humane slaughter. So to start with, we have the assumed sentient principle for persons with disorders of consciousness, which is necessitated by the tremendous diagnostic and prognostic uncertainty about the capacity for consciousness and the potential for recovery of consciousness in these patients. And the rate of misdiagnosis has hovered around 40% for decades for these patients. 4 in 10 are potentially misdiagnosed as unconscious or insentient, which is staggering. So the precautionary principle that Jonathan proposes here is to assume these individuals are sentient, with the capacity for valenced experiences, prompting us to attend to avoiding suffering in these patients. This is quite reasonable and necessary, I think, for people who, for the most part, were once certainly sentient and are now downgraded, if you will, to sentience candidates. So two proposals that follow from this are the need for more humane options for end of life for these patients, more humane than the withdrawal of nutrition and hydration, which is slow, often taking weeks or more, and something that families of these patients understandably find agonizing to contemplate and to experience. And the upshot of having better, quicker options could be, and Jonathan thinks it could be, that the pressure to act within a short window of time after an acute brain injury might be relieved. This is the pressure to withdraw life-sustaining treatment within a few days after a brain injury to avoid a prolonged death later, which helps facilitate his proposal 6, which is waiting for more information about these patients and their potential for recovery, which is something that I have also advocated for. Whether more humane options for death would relieve that pressure is something that hasn't been empirically studied or verified. I think it would be a really important research priority. And as Jonathan says of these patients, they are a poorly understood and exceptionally vulnerable condition. But there's no reason to think that they've lost their personhood, dignity, or rights. And this is an important acknowledgement because there are those who have argued on the basis of the supposed unconsciousness of these patients that it would be ethical to use them for organ donation or for invasive biomedical experimentation or as gestational surrogates. And now I want to jump into sentience candidates more generally, and specifically other animals. Those identified as sentience candidates are all adult vertebrates and some invertebrates. We already have pretty good evidence for some fishes, octopuses, and some insects, but not plants, not unicellular organisms. I have no quarrel with any of this, although I will, as you will see, have a few bones to pick. Ultimately, with how precautionary sentience candidature obligates us to act towards these beings. So Jonathan identifies as a fixed point the duty to avoid gratuitous suffering to sentient beings. And to that end, he proposes codes of good practice and licensing requirements to establish welfare standards equivalent to those for farming of vertebrate animals in an ethically defensible way. I'm skeptical that such standards have already been established in principle or in practice, and a proposal for humane slaughter with an acknowledgement that our current state of knowledge makes it difficult to be confident that slaughter is humane. It's easier to be confident about what is inhumane. So here I want to go back to that statement he made about human sentience candidates. They are a person in a poorly understood and exceptionally vulnerable condition, but this is no reason to think they have lost their personhood, their dignity, or their rights. And I think this is right, and I think it tells us that in the human case there is more to personhood than sentience, and that there are other interests that survive the loss of consciousness and sentience that matter when we think about these patients. That some patients would want us to keep them alive even if they're not conscious and might never again be conscious, and some who would not want to live in a severely impaired state even if they're conscious or sentient. My point here being that there are many ways to suffer harms to one's personhood and one's rights, to one's being, and this is true of humans and also true of other animals. And one of the ways a being can be harmed is by the loss of its life, by the loss of all future experiences, whether those are valenced experiences or not, by the loss of relationships, familial relationships, and self-determination. Which leads to thinking about humane slaughter practices. Like humane death procedures for humans, I don't think those address those other ways that creatures can be harmed. Pragmatically speaking, they may be the best practical solution to entrenched human cultural practices and beliefs, and I greatly appreciate the emphasis on what is practical and pragmatic in this book, although I want to be cautious about confusing the practical and the bias towards the status quo with the ethical. So given that, given the diverse ways that harm and suffering can be inflicted on humans and other animals, and the enormous uncertainty about the experiences, the values, the beliefs, the cultures of other animals, what is a truly proportionate and precautionary approach to their uncertain sentience? So I just want to close by pointing to what I think is an unresolved tension here when it comes to sentience candidates and to investigation priorities. Those beings whose sentience is even more uncertain, with even less scientific evidence. What are the appropriately precautionary and proportionate ways to study sentience and consciousness? Jonathan says explicitly and usefully, sentience is not pain. Yet pain and inducing pain and observing how a creature responds to painful stimuli is so frequently the method, so entrenched as a method to study, evaluate, and confirm sentience, both in animals, but also in humans with disorders of consciousness, where that kind of research is also conducted. But assuming that it is our duty to avoid gratuitous suffering, to avoid inflicting gratuitous suffering on sentient beings, I think there is a large, lingering question about how we go about resolving our uncertainty about sentience in a way that's in harmony with that duty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid. Our next speaker is Claudia Pasos. Claudia is assistant professor at the NYU Center for Bioethics. She has PhDs in philosophy and public health, and her current research focuses on the development of consciousness, including what theories of consciousness say about infant, animal, and machine consciousness, and how these theories shed light on ethical issues. So again, perfect for this occasion. Thank you so much for being here, Claudia. Please welcome Claudia.
Okay. Oops. Okay, sorry. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here commenting on Jonathan Birch's book. I'll try to keep track of the slides, but maybe I see you'll have some problems with the clicks. Okay, so The Edge of Sentience is an excellent book. It's extremely well written, it's well reasoned, it's insightful, it's accessible, it's informative. It's a book for the general audience, for philosophers, scientists, bioethicists, for public policymakers, and for anyone teaching courses on those topics. It covers 4 different areas: philosophy, neuroscience, applied ethics, and policy. It uses our best philosophy and neuroscience of consciousness to address issues about which humans and non-humans are conscious. And it uses ethics and policy to offer guidelines for public policy regarding the cases on the edge of sentience. At the same time, the book tackles with difficulties in the science of consciousness that have generated hot debates and disagreements. Jonathan Birch navigates those issues, offering a reasonable and inclusive landscape for the field, which views should be taken seriously, which views should not, applying the idea of reasonable disagreement, and at the same time offering his own perspective on the matter. Given the theoretical disagreement in the science of consciousness, it's hard to give a plausible assessment of the evidence that can generate conclusions that can guide us in the ethical decision processes assessing the borderline cases. Jonathan is excellent on this point. Not just gives a map of the theories, but illuminates where and how the areas of disagreement emerge and how we should treat them. The map of the main landmarks in the zone of reasonable disagreement concerning metaphysics, functions, neurobasis, and ethical significance is an example of this. A key chapter on the book is chapter 6, covering conversion precautions, where Jonathan argues for a zone of meta-consensus agreement among radical different views on consciousness, and his methodology to apply this framework to generate evidence-based predictions about different cases on the edge, which creature is a sentient creature. So this is the precautionary framework he proposes. It requires a meta-consensus, the bridging concepts he mentions, the sentience candidate, and the investigation priority, and has an overlapping consensus on the need of the take proportionate precautions. Okay, the meta-consensus regarding the theories, I'll just skip this slide. I think this is where you find the meta-consensus, okay? A key chapter in the book about this meta-consensus shows this range of realistic possibilities that must be taken seriously on practical context. Okay, chapter 10 is this chapter I will focus my comment. And ask the hard questions of when does consciousness emerge during development and whether features are conscious. So just, I don't know, something on my click. Okay, so I'll focus my comments on fetal consciousness. So Jonathan proposes we should recognize human fetus as sentience candidates from the start of the second trimester, 12 weeks of gestation. He claims that this aligns with the earliest scientifically credible evidence-based estimates in the zone of the reasonable disagreement. It's widely accepted that fetus develop nociceptors, specialized receptors sensitive to tissue damage, at around 10 and 13 weeks of gestation. And this is from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. What is highly controversial is whether this nociception is accompanied by subjective pain experience, especially since the cortex has not yet developed at this stage. So here are the recommendations from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So according to this recommendation, pain awareness requires the cortical connections, and the lack of cortical connections before 24 weeks and the lack of cortical connection before 24 weeks, therefore, implies that pain is not possible until after 24 weeks. But Jonathan uses more recently finding that is in this quote by other neuroscientists. So Jonathan suggests that what has in the recommendation for the Royal College has a sort of anti-precautionary fallacy. Just because the majority holds that the cortex is necessary for pain awareness, this does not mean that the alternative views is not possible. He points to theorists such as Bjorn Merker, who hold that consciousness may arise from evolutionary ancient mechanisms as the mid-brain structures without cortex. And he argues that this view falls within the range of reasonable disagreement. The midbrain structures that are most relevant for consciousness develop, according to this view, develop around 12 weeks. As a result, Jonathan thinks that 12 weeks fetus are at least sentience candidates. There is a reasonable possibility that they are sentience. I raised two problems for Jonathan's approach concerning the methodology and implications for policy. So here is his proposal that 12 weeks of gestation, fetus at 12 weeks of gestation would be sentience candidates. Issues about the methodology. So it's unclear whether Merker's view is really part of the meta-consensus about consciousness. Merker's view is often regarded as somewhat marginal, and I think a large majority of neuroscientists would reject it. In a 2022 paper, Salomons and Yanity say that there is a long-standing consensus that the cortex is necessary for pain awareness. Perhaps Jonathan disagrees about what the consensus is, but if so, this brings out that there is no meta-consensus, at least in the sense of a consensus about the consensus. There is also no clear consensus that consciousness without cortex is a realistic possibility, which is what Birch, Jonathan's meta-consensus requires. We can also put the point in terms of evidence. Suppose we have many pieces of strong evidence that consciousness requires a cortex fetal consciousness at 24 weeks of gestation. That is compatible with most theories endorsed by most neuroscientists in the field. And we have another piece of evidence in favor of Merker's view. How should we balance those options? Should we use Merker's view to formulate policy, even if it is much less weakly supported by evidence? At some point, it seems that the weight of evidence should affect what is in the zone of reasonable disagreement. The map of realistic possibilities does not give guidance on how we should weigh evidence. Furthermore, theorists typically disagree about what the evidence supports, so we need some tools for accommodating the disagreement. Perhaps we could appeal to consensus or meta-consensus about relevant evidence, but in this case, there seems to be no such consensus and no such meta-consensus. One alternative should be to adopt the cluster approach discussed by Jonathan, and it seems he is sympathetic with this approach. The cluster approach suggests we should search for clusters of markers and its causes from which we could infer the presence of consciousness. So instead of relying on any particular marker of consciousness, for instance, the neural basis of pain, we should search for developmental clusters of various markers of sentience from which we could reasonably infer a prediction for around which week of gestation consciousness emerges. In this regard, the standard view, at least currently, is that development of the thalamocortical connectivity around 24 weeks involves numerous K markers. A revision of that view would need a more compelling evidence. Okay, now the policy implications for the relation between sentience and abortion. Okay, so coming back to the question that the book asks, are second trimester fetus a sentience candidate, an investigation priority, or neither of these? Jonathan's policy proposal is that we should take the earliest evidence-based estimate as the point at which discussions about proportionality are warranted. However, this seems a bit too fast conclusion given other aspects that should be considered in this case, mainly important impact on abortion rights, as Jonathan discussed on section 10.2. So in this section, he does an excellent job dissociating the right to life involved in discussion around abortion and our duty to avoid causing gratuitous suffering to sentient creatures. Ultimately, Jonathan's proposal about abortion is that issues of sentience should be separated from issues of abortion policy. And you see this in the proposal number 7. However, this is not what actually happens. On 24 June of 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled out on the Dobbs and Jackson Human Health Organization case. The court upheld the state of Mississippi's law banning most of abortion after the 15th week of pregnancy, based on the argument that fetus can feel pain as early as 12 weeks after conception. This brings out that in practice, considerations about pain and consciousness in fetus cannot be entirely decoupled from abortion policy. So I wonder if it's wise to allow somewhat marginal theories of consciousness, such Merker's view that consciousness is possible without cortex, to influence policy here. If Merker's view was reclassified alongside plant consciousness, for instance, as just outside the zone of reasonable agreement, then we would reclassify second trimester fetus as investigation priorities, which might later turn out to be sentience candidates, not as sentience candidates, which influence current policy. Yeah, so this is what I would suggest. Okay, moreover, even if you accept reclassifying second trimester fetus as investigation priorities, this could still be compatible with adopting the precautionary measure that is relevant for Jonathan regarding pain relief to the fetus in the second trimester when performing surgery in therapeutic context and in the therapeutic context and in abortion, as his proposal 9 and 10. Okay, that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And last but not least, we have John Adenitire, who is a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary University of London. He completed his PhD in law at the University of Cambridge, and he is co-author of Animals and the Constitution Towards Sentience-Based Constitutionalism, coming out next year from Oxford University Press. Stay tuned for that. And co-director of the Forum on Decentering the Human at QMUL. So once again, a perfect person for this event. And thank you so much for being here, John. And please welcome John.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, especially a pleasure to be here for Jonathan's book, which is such a wonderful book. So I'm delighted that I can say a few words. I will mostly say things in praise of the book, and a few quibbles here and there, but they're also to be taken in the spirit of praise for the book. So let's start with the praises. First of all, this is a wonderful book to read and to listen to, because I discovered to my pleasure that there is an audio version available, which I listen to, which is great. So if you are that inclined, that's also a way. But it's very accessible. It is, I think, the underlying research is extremely rigorous, but the way the prose comes out is wonderful. So thank you very much. So that's praise number one. Praise number two, unlike many philosophers or theorists that spend most of their work talking, their work is used by other colleagues and is in this kind of silo that no one's entered but the 5 or 10 people who are specialized and can do that. Jonathan has actually done a lot of impressive work that has received attention well beyond academia. And my field is animal law, animal rights law, and more than anyone else, his work on animal sentience has impacted the way animal welfare, especially for octopuses and other kinds of invertebrate, have been protected in UK law. So I hope that at least some of the recommendations that he makes in this book, as well as the work that's done in the past, gets fully implemented. So I'm so grateful for the impact, real life impact, other than academic impact, that the book is having. Final compliment is that the theoretical insights of the book are so great that I've managed to incorporate them in my own manuscript in the book that I'm writing now on sentience-based constitutionalism, and this real attention to what sentience means, and this idea of subjective experiences of a valence nature is basically we took it word by word and incorporated it in our book. So thank you for that, Jonathan. Okay, so if you indirect praises in terms of quibbles here and there. As I said, my main interest is in animal law, especially animal rights law. So you may think of it as an area of, well, I'm one of those animal rights scholars that sometimes it picks out in the book. And I think Jonathan is very aware that some of the recommendations when it comes to animals in the book are very thin and will be criticized by animal rights lawyers or animal rights supporters. So I'll do just that. I'll criticize it. But I know the limitations of my critique because I unlike Jonathan, I work in a university. Well, he works in a university too, but I don't have any ambition that my work will change the world. Whereas he is very practical. He wants to really change the world, and even the not as ambitious changes that he proposes will still make the world a better place if they were fully implemented. So in the book, when he's talking about treatment of animals and what sentience means for animals, both those that are sentient candidates and those that are investigation priorities, the recommendations are as follows. For sentient candidates, it says that we should not inflict gratuitous suffering on animals that are sentient candidates. And for those that are investigation priorities, that we should have a licensing scheme. Now, from a UK context, at least in terms of sentence candidates, this is almost already the law. Of course, there are areas of exceptions, but the general thrust in UK law, in UK animal welfare law, is that we should avoid inflicting unnecessary suffering on animals. And this is codified in the Animal Welfare Act and in the various regulations that follow from that. So it seems that there's not much that an animal rights supporter would take from this recommendation. And so I investigate the book. Why do we have such thin proposals for change when it comes to sentient animals? It happens that Jonathan is looking for a convergence of ethical views, right? Ethicals and what he calls religious views or theistic views, right? And the result of this, two results. One is very practical, is if, despite all of our disagreements, we can agree on something, then we can actually do something, right? We can proceed, we can have actual policy change, and this is what Jonathan wants to achieve, so I have nothing to say, that's great. But on the other hand, it means that we can only proceed on the basis of the lowest common denominator, right? So we can have animal rights lawyers, we can have factory farming CEOs, and of course the range of agreement between these would be very minimal, and if we proceed on the way that Jonathan proposes, we will always go for the minimalist ethical view. And this is also very important because Jonathan also wants to include theistic accounts, so he goes very rigorously through at least some theistic conceptions, like Christian conceptions, Jain conceptions, Abrahamic religions, etc., etc. And I thought that was very useful. But in this overview, it doesn't really give us, at least for the ethical frameworks, what should count within the range of reasonable views. So it gives us this when it comes to the scientific theories of sentience, saying something along the lines that the views must be sincere, informed. But when it comes to ethical, non-dogmatic, when it comes to the ethical theories, it's not clear what is a reasonable ethical view and what is a non-reasonable ethical view, especially if we have this criteria of non-dogmatism. And I hope I will be forgiven. I hope not to offend anyone in the room, but many theistic traditions have, at least in some way in which they are interpreted or practiced, some measure of dogmatic thinking. And if we want to include them within our reasonable conceptions of what to do about animals, then I'm not sure on Jonathan's own criteria why they are included. But this goes beyond theistic conceptions. There are theorists and philosophers that argue in Descartesian fashions that animals do not feel pain. And they are very sophisticated, or apparently very sophisticated reasons for those. And they publish them in peer-reviewed journals. They are philosophically, at least they have an appearance of philosophical rigor, but they will go even well below what Jonathan proposes. So why are they not included in the zone of reasonable disagreement? So if they were to be included, given that they are not dogmatic, they are well informed, they are open, then it would follow that animals can be treated however we want, whether maliciously or not. So my invitation would be, I guess, to take an animal rights view. Unfortunately, perhaps that would not result in progress in policy making, but at least it would have the advantage, on my view, of being more principled. So that's all I have to say, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. So I want to open it up for questions and discussion soon, but first I do want to invite Jonathan to offer just a few brief remarks in response. Obviously, these were very rich commentaries, and we won't be able to fully respond to all of them right now, but maybe we can start with some responses and then let the rest come out in the broader discussion. So please feel free to take it away.
I'm being picked up. It is wonderful. Yes, thanks so much to all of you. I mean, I'm quite a connoisseur of the commentary as an art form, and those were three fantastic examples. I'm so pleased. Wonderful in giving very fair reconstructions of my views, in giving a good sense of the shape of the project. You know, as I was saying earlier, it has this slightly Kitcher-inspired shape of mapping out a zone of reasonable disagreement, aiming to find points of convergence, points of consensus, then trying to ground the proposals in those, in the thought that, well, this is something we can all agree on, let's go do it right now. And in different ways, you're all putting interesting critical pressure of exactly the right kind on a project with that shape, because, of course, such a project will invite debate about exactly how the boundaries of the zone of reasonable disagreement are to be drawn, and you were all doing that in different ways. I think with Sid, I mean, in your case, there was the issue of the harm of death, and it's absolutely fair, I think, that because the book is looking for points of consensus, harm of death is a conspicuous case where there is no such consensus. And so the emphasis is then placed on avoiding causing gratuitous suffering. And the proposals, the 26 proposals are all supposed to be grounded in that. And inevitably that will be frustratingly limiting to someone who suspects, as I do in my own sort of personal views, suspects that there are plenty of harms done to animals beyond gratuitous suffering, and that death is one of these. In your commentary, Claudia, you were putting pressure on the zone of reasonable disagreement in a somewhat different way. Again, in a way absolutely central to the project, because the status of midbrain-centric theories like Merker's and Panksepp's, and more recently Mark Soames in his book Hidden Spring, and some of Antonio Damasio's work as well. The status of these theories is really important, and I didn't want to shy away from the tension that I see between a lot of people working on animal sentience who say there is overwhelming evidence that there can be consciousness without a cortex. How could you even suggest such a thing? Have you seen a fish? And take it as pretty clear that some theory of that type is correct. Versus, as you pointed out, the received wisdom of institutions like the Royal College of Gynecologists and Obstetricians, tasked with producing advice on fetal sentience, where the assumption that a cortex is necessary plays an absolutely central role in that advice and continues to do so. Now, the tension is real. I think it's pretty clear from the book, which side of the tension I'm on, and where I think the evidence points. I think it does point towards taking the midbrain-centric views extremely seriously, and the book aims to make a case for that. And then, that's going to be a point of ongoing debate and disagreement, I think, about whether it does so successfully. And then, John, in your commentary, again, it was this issue of reasonable views, but you're thinking about the space of ethical views, and about, firstly, why am I so inclusive? Why am I so inclusive of Abrahamic positions, for example, that to me, as someone looking to improve the lives of animals, it's often very, very frustrating. Very frustrating to read major religious texts and find that so little of my own personal viewpoint is reflected in those texts. Nonetheless, in the book, it seemed really important to me that overlapping consensus must include these views to be of the kind to generate genuinely legitimate outcomes in which we can have confidence in a society in which many, many people do subscribe to those viewpoints. So again, it's a real tension on which people are going to fall down on different sides. And I fall down on the inclusive side there. Then you say, well, could one perhaps, why stop there, and why not go even further and include views on which not even a duty to avoid causing gratuitous suffering is recognized? And in my opinion, there are no such doctrines that are sufficiently worked out to be genuine ethical outlooks. And again, that would be a real source of challenge to the view if there were such outlooks. But I think there aren't. So, the book makes a case for defining the zone of reasonable disagreement in the way that it does. And, of course, people have to read the book to make their own minds up about, on these fault lines, which side they're going to come down on. But what I hope is that the general shape of the project can be quite agreeable to all the camps there, because hopefully, we've made some progress of a kind. If we're arguing about these questions, we've already moved beyond those intractable ones about is the system sentient or not, and what's the correct ethical outlook. We've recognized we're going to disagree about those things. We've moved on instead to this question about, given that we want to base policy on points of overlapping consensus, how are we going to identify those? And to me, that's it's a kind of progress, I think. And the proposals are extremely moderate, as John and Sid, I think both of you pointed out. Very, very moderate. My own personal views would involve going well beyond these things if I could be a dictator, if I could legislate for the whole of society. But I'm trying to, I suppose, recast the role of the philosopher in these debates, as it were. I criticize the view of philosopher as sage, who knows the right ethical position and wants to lay down the law to all of humanity. There's often quite a tragic aspect to that because typically no one listens to such a philosopher. What I want to do instead is make proposals that I think really could be adopted right now, and that I can sincerely advocate to governments around the world as things that they can immediately enact. And the 26 proposals should very much be read in that spirit rather than as rules for a utopian society. So thanks very much again. Wonderful commentaries. And they identified points of debate where the book succeeded if it generates debate on those issues. That's what I wanted to do with these proposals, to put them out there to generate debate. And it's wonderful to see that debate already happening. Thank you.
Yeah, great. All right, we can now go to questions in the room. We will start with Dave Chalmers right here in the front row, and we have some mics coming around, so please hold on just a second.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great book, great comments, great session. I'm interested in this key notion of a sentience candidate and the definition of it that you give. Just a few different thoughts about it. One is this second key notion of realistic possibility, which plays a central role in that definition, and there's so many discussions of the book. But as far as I can tell, you never actually define realistic possibility. The closest I got was this chart from the British government where they say realistic possibility corresponds to 40% chance, to which you then quite reasonably say, that sounds too high to me for a reasonable possibility. But okay, so we're just left with somewhere under 40%. So I guess one question is it 5% or 10%, or should it be understood in some very different way? Because that makes a huge difference to the conclusions of the book. I was just curious about that. A second point is that in the definition of a sentience candidate, you bring in a realistic possibility of sentience, but you also bring in the second normative part, which is it's actually a realistic possibility of sentience, that it would be irresponsible to ignore when making policy decisions that will affect us. Well, I mean, there's sort of a worry now that there's a slight circularity insofar in using this notion for making policy decisions. It kind of puts off the question to, well, let's figure out what is the possibility that it would be irresponsible to ignore, then that's the standard that we'll use to responsibly make decisions. You might have thought that you were actually going to give us the substantive notion of realistic possibility that you thought substantively was the criterion for it being irresponsible to ignore it, but didn't quite see that. And the final thing was just echoing something Claudia said. There's a lot of disagreement about what is a realistic possibility and what's a reasonable view. And you talk a bit in the book about how, although there may be no consensus on the first order views of what's conscious, maybe there'll at least be this meta-consensus on which views are reasonable. I think it's my thought, and I think Claudia brought this out in pointing to neuroscientists. There's as much disagreement on what's a realistic possibility as on the first order views about what's conscious. I kind of suspect that if we did polls on this, we'd find no more meta-consensus than we find consensus. I'm wondering how that plays into your account of sentience candidates.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I certainly do see among the researchers working on questions of sentience, I see more meta-consensus than consensus. Let's put it that way. And yes, so there is this optimistic element in the book, I suppose, of putting out there the proposal that there is this meta-consensus, in effect inviting people to disagree with that, I suppose, in the way that Claudia has. And then, in a way, betting that, well, the meta-consensus is pretty robust there, and that the theories that are in it, there really is evidence establishing their realistic possibilities. And then, as you say, in defining what a realistic possibility is, there's this deliberate avoidance of numerical thresholds, where I really didn't want to say it has to be at least 10%, because I think if we're talking about objective probabilities, these numbers are indeterminate. I think if we're talking about subjective degrees of belief, they're enormously variable from one person to the next. And so it wouldn't really serve the aim of making a framework for public policy to try and put this threshold in numerical terms. So I was thinking, well, what would serve that aim then? And what does serve that aim, I think, is the idea of setting a bar for recklessness or negligence. We're talking about a probabilistic matter, but there's some vague threshold where it becomes irresponsible to ignore. The bar for negligence or recklessness, if you just carry on as though that were not even a possibility, has been crossed. And this judgment is inherently a mixed judgment. This is echoing Anna Alexandrova and Anu Plutinsky's work, where they both use this category of mixed judgment, where it's inherently not just a scientific judgment. It's not something you could entirely leave to be purely factual. There is this ethical component to it as well. But we should not attempt to disentangle those two things, because we've sort of reached the limit of how far the scientific and the ethical can be fruitfully disentangled. We should just accept that this is inherently a mixed judgment. When has the possibility become irresponsible to ignore? And the proposal is that way of setting things up is, I suppose, more in tune with how policy is usually made, and also more useful when the goal is to be developing a framework for designing policy.
Great. Now we also have questions coming in online as well. And like I said, I want to try to alternate. So I'll read one from Zoom, and then we can go back to a question from here in the room. So Chloe online notes that we had mentioned the book takes a pragmatic approach, and then wonders if the current political environment surrounding women's rights was considered in the discussion of sentience and the protections that should be afforded. So specifically, is there any examination of the juxtaposition between the potential use of individuals in vegetative states as surrogates and the undisputed sentience and, of course, agency and autonomy of fully conscious women and their right to bodily autonomy?
Yes, I mean, it's great that Claudia raised that whole issue. It's one of the most controversial parts of the book, lots to discuss about it. Totally, great that you did, and the question is continuing with that. I think it's obviously a very difficult, sensitive case to talk about. There is a lot of discussion in the relevant chapter of the book about bodily autonomy, and this idea that Claudia mentioned, that in fact bodily autonomy overrides questions of sentience in this case, and that it would be inappropriate to take the sentience candidate concept as defining some kind of legal limit on the right to access abortion. And of course, in the case of using people with disorders of consciousness as surrogates non-consensually, I'm obviously extremely opposed to that for all the reasons that are given in that chapter of the book. It's great if we're thinking, though, about how to handle the different cases consistently. A lot of what the book is about is trying to feel that pressure of consistency and see where it leads.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question over here. Yeah.
So I was wondering, or I also had a question about your notion of a sentience candidate. So I was wondering if your notion of a sentience candidate suggests that there might be a system A and a system B such that we have the same credence in A being conscious and in B being conscious, but in which we can only conclude that A or B is a sentience candidate. So, perhaps we have equal credence in the view that certain severely brain damaged patients are conscious as we do in the view that ants are conscious, and we have, and we're justified in having those credences. But for some other reason, perhaps potential for agency or something like that, we can't ignore or we can't not focus on considering the possibility of consciousness of brain damaged patients in our ethical decision making, but we can't ignore the possibility of ants being conscious in our ethical decision making.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible. Yeah, the way the sentience concept is set up and the fact that it's not defined in terms of credences leaves open the possibility that equal credence does not imply equal sentience candidature. Absolutely, yeah.
We have a question right over here, blue shirt.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book and a great panel as well. My question is another aspect of the candidacy status. So can you illuminate a little bit about what you think about the debate between the sort of light switch view of consciousness or sentience and the sort of gradient view of sentience, and how that matters for how the precautionary principle should apply. So what does it mean for someone to be a candidate? Does it mean that they are kind of like in the same level as human beings, sentience, or does it mean that there could be like a broad category of things that there's a kind of a gradient or a hierarchy of sentience, then those that are kind of at the lower end of it we treat differently than those at the higher end? Thanks.
Yes, I wanted to make sure that my proposals in the book did not depend on any particular stance on that question. So nothing is assumed about degrees of sentience. And in fact, I'm pretty skeptical of that concept. The reasons are given in the paper Dimensions of Animal Consciousness in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where I'm much more in favor of the idea of variation in a multidimensional space with many dimensions of variation, but no way to aggregate those dimensions to produce an overall degree of sentience. So because of my background skepticism about that idea, I didn't want any of the proposals to depend on taking a controversial stance on it. And so all the proposals are grounded in this idea that when a being is sentient at all, there's a duty to avoid causing gratuitous suffering to that being, leading to this duty to take proportionate steps in the face of risk.
All right. I'm going to ask a quick question of my own, and then I see a couple of hands here. So I wanted to return to the exchange you were having, Jonathan, with the commenters. And I was especially interested in your response to challenges to your conception of reasonability. And I was wondering if your conception of reasonability might be combining what philosophers or political theorists might call a kind of ideal theory and non-ideal theory conception of reasonability. So in other words, one is about what really counts as a reasonable view, and you have to, be respectful and open-minded. And as long as you have really thought through the issues in a sufficiently respectful and open-minded way, then you kind of count as reasonable and your view should be included. And then there would be a more non-ideal theory kind of pragmatic answer, which is, look, we are in the business of doing politics and policy, and that means building coalitions with people who are sufficiently like-minded. And if I can build a coalition with a pretty diverse range of perspectives, but we can at least agree on this much and get that large enough to amass enough power to nudge policy, then that would be enough, right? And I was just wondering, it seems like you want to be doing both. You want to be trying to include everyone whose views are sort of ideally reasonable, but then also including enough groups so that you can get enough consensus so that you can shift policy realistically. Right. And I was just wondering, why not just offer the non-ideal pragmatic answer to, for example, John's question? Like if you discovered in the wild a group of people who were totally reasonable in the sense that they were informed and rational, but then they just want to cause gratuitous suffering, why is it not enough to just say, well, you can be in the other coalition and we can duke it out in politics, and hopefully my coalition with the Christians and the Kantians and everybody else will be big enough that we can just defeat you in the political arena?
Yeah, I mean, chapter 3 of the book has my best attempt at fleshing out this idea of reasonableness. Whereas you say it's not one thing. We're trying to characterize reasonable disagreement about sentience. There's all kinds of ways in which disagreement can be derailed, by troll-like positions, by people simply not responding to evidence. And reasonable disagreement is about disagreement between reasonable people holding reasonable views. And the criteria are different for the two elements. The criteria for what makes a view reasonable is precisely to do with, well, how much evidence is in its favor and so on. Is there any evidence of the right kinds? And that's fundamentally different from what makes a person reasonable, which is about responsiveness to arguments, willingness to change one's mind, and so on. And I think that's fine that, we're talking about disagreements where both elements are in place. Yeah, and your question is getting at, well, to what extent could one make the sort of nakedly pragmatic move of saying, well, your position is just not part of this.
Right.
Trying to build a coalition, and you're not one of the people we want to involve. And I don't make that move in the book. John was suggesting maybe I should in relation to certain religious positions, but I don't. There's a certain reluctance to do that, I think.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I saw another hand over here. Yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So, in the book, you define sentience partly with affect and valence as a necessary condition of it. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that and invite you to say a bit more about why you include that. So, it seems that when people talk about valence, there are potentially at least two different things that one might be talking about. So in some cases, there are these kind of clear valenced emotional states, like sort of maybe being in sort of agony or feeling elated, for instance. Then sometimes people use the notion of valence too in this kind of more functional way of governing behavior, sort of aversive or sort of like motivational behavior.
Yeah.
Sometimes people also talk as if those were the same things. And then kind of fudge it a little bit with sort of unconscious valence, for example.
Yeah.
It seems non-trivial to me whether these are the same things, and I would bet that they're not. So I guess that insofar as we take evidence of this kind of motivational kind to be in support of sort of very basic creatures having sentience, and then take the kind of moral upshots of the more sophisticated notion of valence, of these kind of emotional states, that could kind of create a sort of move where we take, the evidence in support of this kind of for supporting the simple creatures having a higher moral status than we would be inclined to do if we separated the notions. That's my worry. And anyway, that was I'm just inviting you to say more about how you think about the relation between these things.
It's a very complicated landscape. You can see that, even setting aside all the disagreement about consciousness, there's also disagreement about the nature of valence, and one needs to take this into account as well. Certainly in recent philosophy, you get three very different views vying with each other. There's Carruthers' view on which valence is about the representation of value, where it's really an aim of the account to characterize valence in a way that could allow it to be unconscious in many, many cases, versus the idea of valence as hedonic quality, something essentially experiential, and then other views that are neither one thing nor the other, like imperativist views that say it's about content, but the content is something like less of me or more of me. And what I suggest in the book is that, well, in the end, none of my proposals are dependent on any particular assumption about the right account of valence. But you're right that it's important to try and avoid hidden pitfalls, where, for example, the line of reasoning for thinking some particular evidence is relevant, like the motivational trade-off behavior in crabs, for example, smuggles in some assumption about the nature of valence. And, I think it doesn't, but you're totally right to say that is a pitfall one has to avoid.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and I know there are so many, but I saw a hand right back there, so why don't we go right there, and we'll probably wrap it at that point with apologies.
Apologies if you addressed this in the book, but I was curious. I know that Ilias Sutskever at OpenAI has talked about potentially like training models on data sets that don't have sentient or discussion of sentience and seeing if they still report sentient experiences. And I was curious, kind of with that as an example, are you sort of optimistic about the possibility of eventually dissolving this problem of other minds and getting to a place where we have like higher confidence in, I'm particularly interested in AI systems, but other non-human minds, whether or not they have sentience, or do you view the sort of like precautionary sentience candidate framework as something that we'll be dealing with for kind of more on a going forward basis?
It will be with us for the long term, yeah. I mean, the book is about middle paths, middle grounds on many different issues. In this, in the case of AI sentience, like many of the other cases in the book, the slogan "no magic tricks" is always there. I don't think our doubts can be resolved conclusively for quite strong reasons. But there's still evidence. We can still use evidence to inform our decisions, inform our deliberations, to inform our citizens' assemblies, and so on. I think that's just as true in the AI case as in the animal case and other cases in the book. Of course, in a way, the debate is at an earlier stage with AI. It's often about trying to convince people to have that debate at all, and to take the issue seriously, which is what Jeff and I have been doing with the Taking AI Welfare Seriously article. I think we're at a very early stage, but there needs to be we've got good reasons to invest a lot of energy and resources in trying to develop better tests. As you say, it would be very good for the design of those tests if we could completely purge the training data of all references to emotion, feeling, subjective experience. I just can't imagine how that could be achieved. It's one direction people should work in. Let's see if it can be achieved. But I've been thinking more recently, more along the lines of, well, assuming that can't be done, what could still be relevant evidence, even for a system that does have training data replete with emotion, feeling, the language it needs to mimic the way humans express feelings.
Okay, great. Well, I think this is a good place to end. And so first of all, I just want to thank the speakers for excellent commentary, Sid, Claudia, and John. And then thank you again to Jonathan for writing this book and being here to launch it at NYU. I really appreciate it, and congratulations again. And then thanks again to Sophia and David for putting this event together, to the Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law for hosting it alongside the Center for Mind Ethics and Policy, and then again to the Center for Bioethics and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness for co-sponsoring as well, and to everybody for attending both in person and online. Really appreciate it in all cases. Thank you.